This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Ethan Carter had always been the sort of man who faded into the background. At 30 years old, he had built a life in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. From the outside, his existence seemed nothing short of ordinary, even idyllic. A modest single-story home with a well-manicured lawn, a dependable used car parked in the driveway, and a respectable job as a high school science teacher, all pointed to someone who had followed the expected path of adulthood. To the neighbors who occasionally waved at him as he came and went, Ethan was a model resident, polite, reserved, and unremarkable in every way. But beneath the surface of this seemingly benign existence lay a mind that churned with resentment, alienation, and darkness. The neighborhood itself was the kind of place where nothing truly bad was supposed to happen. It was a small, tight-knit community of about 30 houses, all built in the late 1980s, with identical layouts and variations of beige and gray siding. The residents took pride in the illusion of togetherness, hosting block parties, sharing landscaping tips, and keeping an unspoken, but ever-present, competition over whose yard looked the most pristine. Children rode bicycles up and down the cul-de-sac, their laughter mingling with the hum of lawnmowers and the occasional bark of a dog. Parents congregated on porches in the evenings, wine glasses in hand, trading stories about their jobs and their children's school accomplishments. It was a picture of suburban comfort and camaraderie, a place where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. Ethan, however, had never quite fit into the social rhythm of the neighborhood. While others gathered for cookouts and holiday decorating contests, he preferred solitude. He never declined an invitation outright. He knew better than to draw attention to himself. But he always had an excuse ready, grading papers, attending teacher workshops, or simply being too tired from a long day at school were his go-to responses. In truth, Ethan loathed the forced smiles, the shallow conversations, and the intrusive questions about his personal life. He had no family to speak of, no partner, no children, and no close friends. This absence of attachments set him apart in a community where family life was the cornerstone of social interaction. Though no one said it outright, Ethan could sense the unease his solitary existence evoked in others. They didn't trust what they couldn't understand, and a single man with no apparent desire to build the conventional life they all cherished was, in their eyes, an anomaly. Ethan's students knew him as Mr. Carter, a competent, if slightly stern teacher who rarely deviated from the curriculum. He wasn't the kind of teacher who inspired lifelong admiration or deep affection, but he also wasn't the kind who garnered complaints. He arrived on time, delivered his lessons with precision, and maintained order in his classroom. His colleagues respected his professionalism, but often found him aloof. Dr. Evans was determined to focus on medical school, and he was an achieved rock star. He never joined the staff for happy hours or contributed much to faculty meetings beyond the bare minimum. In the controlled environment of his classroom, Ethan felt safe. The lab equipment, the chemical formulas, and the rigid structure of the academic calendar provided him with a sense of order that the outside world seemed to lack. But outside the classroom, in the quiet moments of his own home, Ethan's mind was anything but orderly. His thoughts often drifted to the neighbors who surrounded him, their lives so different from his own. He watched them from his living room window as they walked their dogs or chatted on the sidewalk, their laughter grating against his ears. To him, they were actors in a play, their smiles rehearsed, their conversations scripted, their lives empty of genuine meaning. He saw through the facades of friendliness and community spirit, perceiving instead a web of hypocrisy, judgment, and superficiality. Over time, this perception hardened into a simmering resentment, a deep-seated anger that he struggled to contain. Ethan had never been particularly close to anyone, even as a child. Raised by a single mother who worked long hours as a nurse, he spent much of his youth alone, reading books and tinkering with science experiments in his room. He had always been intelligent, but his intelligence often isolated him from his peers, who found him odd and difficult to relate to. In high school, he was the quiet kid who sat in the back of the class, avoided eye contact, and excelled academically but was never invited to parties or included in group activities. The few friendships he did manage to form were short-lived, as his intensity and inability to connect emotionally often drove people away. Over time, he grew accustomed to being alone, convincing himself that he didn't need anyone and that the world was better observed from a distance. The neighborhood, with its cliques and its unspoken rules of social engagement, felt like a microcosm of the world that had always rejected him. The families who lived there saw themselves as inclusive and welcoming, but Ethan knew better. He noticed the way their smiles faltered when they spoke to him, the way their eyes darted around uncomfortably when he offered a polite comment. He heard the whispers that followed him when he turned his back, the subtle mockery disguised as concern. "Be so quiet," they would say. "You never really know what's going on with someone like that." Over time, these small slights accumulated like drops of acid, eroding what little goodwill Ethan might have once felt toward his neighbors. There was one family in particular that seemed to embody everything Ethan despised about the neighborhood: the Robinsons. With their perfectly coordinated holiday decorations, their golden retriever named Max, and their weekly brunches that spilled onto the front lawn, they were the epitome of suburban perfection. Alan Robinson, the patriarch, was a real estate agent with a booming voice and a handshake that lasted just a beat too long. His wife Linda was a stay-at-home mom who organized the neighborhood's events with an efficiency that bordered on militaristic. Their two teenage daughters, Madison and Chloe, were blonde, beautiful, and popular, the kind of girls who seemed to glide through life without ever encountering a single hardship. To Ethan, the Robinsons were the very definition of artificiality, a family that wore its happiness like a mask to hide the rot beneath. Enough is Ethan's resentment toward the Robinsons and the rest of the neighborhood grew with each passing year. He began to see their actions not just as annoyances, but as personal affronts, deliberate attempts to exclude and belittle him. Every laugh, every whispered conversation, every sidelong glance felt like an attack. He started keeping a journal, pouring his frustrations onto the pages in jagged, angry handwriting. At first, his entries were vague and abstract, musings on the nature of society and the human condition. But as time went on, they became more specific, more focused, and more disturbing. He began cataloging the behaviors of his neighbors, noting their routines, their habits, their weaknesses. It was an outlet, a way to process his emotions. But it also marked the beginning of a dark transformation. In his mind, Ethan began to see himself as a victim of a world that had always misunderstood and mistreated him. His neighbors, with their smiles and their handshakes and their insipid conversations, became the embodiment of everything he hated about society. They were the reason he felt so isolated, so angry, so broken. And as that anger festered, it began to demand an outlet, a release. Ethan didn't know it yet, but the quiet life he had built for himself in that small suburban neighborhood was about to shatter in ways that no one, least of all his unsuspecting neighbors, could have ever imagined. Ethan Carter's life had always been a precarious balance between restraint and the storm of emotions simmering beneath the surface. For years, he had carefully maintained his quiet, detached existence, letting his resentment toward the neighbors grow in the shadows of his mind. It had been manageable, something he could confine to the pages of his journal and the confines of his thoughts. But as the years went on, small, seemingly insignificant moments began to build on each other, like grains of sand accumulating to form a mountain. The breaking point didn't come all at once. It was the culmination of countless slights, whispers, and moments of exclusion that finally pushed Ethan over the edge. The catalyst arrived on a warm summer evening in June, a day that began like any other, but would mark the start of a transformation that no one could have foreseen. Ethan had spent most of the day indoors, grading papers and avoiding the oppressive heat outside. As the sun began to set, painting the set in hues of orange and purple, the familiar sounds of neighborhood life drifted through his open windows. Laughter, music, and the unmistakable sizzle of a grill reached his ears. He glanced outside and immediately felt his stomach twist. The Robinsons were hosting one of their infamous barbecues, and as usual, the entire neighborhood seemed to be in attendance. Ethan watched from behind his curtains, his gaze fixed on the crowd gathered in the Robinsons' backyard. There were familiar faces everywhere, Alan Robinson with his booming laughter, Linda gracefully flitting between groups of guests, and their daughters, Madison and Chloe, chatting with friends by the pool. Ethan's other neighbors were there too, mingling, eating, and drinking, as though they were all part of some exclusive club he could never hope to join. He saw the couples he occasionally waved to in passing, the children who played in the street, the retired couple who always pruned their rose bushes with military precision. They were all there, smiling, laughing, and sharing, in a sense of camaraderie that had never been extended to him. As he stood there, hidden in the shadows of his living room, Ethan felt a familiar bitterness rise in his chest. He had never been invited to one of these barbecues, not once, in all the years he had lived in the neighborhood. He told himself he wouldn't have gone even if he had been invited. He hated those kinds of gatherings. But the exclusion still stung. It was a reminder of how little he mattered to the people around him, how easily they dismissed him as an outsider. He was a ghost in their lives, visible but not truly seen, existing on the periphery of their world. It wasn't just the party itself that bothered him, though. What truly ignited the fire inside him was what he overheard later that night. As the barbecue wound down and the guests began to leave, Ethan stepped outside, under the cover of darkness, to take out his trash. The air was still warm, and the smell of grilled meat lingered in the breeze. He kept his head down as he walked to the curb, not wanting to risk running into any of his neighbors. But as he turned to head back to his house, he heard voices, faint at first, but growing louder as he listened. He realized the voices were coming from the Robinsons' backyard, where a small group of guests had stayed behind, lingering over drinks and casual conversation. At first, the words were indistinct, just the murmur of idle chatter, but then he heard his name. His heart stopped, and he froze in place, straining to hear. The group wasn't speaking loudly, but the quiet night carried their voices, just far enough for Ethan to make out the gist of their conversation. "They're talking about me," he thought, his chest tightening. He caught snippets of their words, phrases like, "weird guy, never see him with anyone," and "kind of creepy." Someone laughed, and another voice chimed in, saying something about how Ethan always seemed to be watching people, how he gave off an unsettling vibe. They weren't yelling, weren't even particularly cruel in their tone, but the words cut deeper than any insult could have. To Ethan, it wasn't just gossip. It was confirmation of everything he had suspected about how his neighbors saw him. They didn't respect him. They didn't like him. They didn't even view him as a real person, just some strange, lonely man who didn't belong. Ethan hurried back inside, his heart pounding and his hands trembling. He didn't turn on any lights, choosing instead to sit in the dark, his mind racing. He tried to tell himself it didn't matter, that he didn't care what they thought of him. But the words echoed in his head, each one a dagger that drove deeper into his psyche. Creepy, weird, unsettling. He had spent his entire life trying to blend in, to avoid drawing attention, to simply exist without judgment. And yet, here he was, the subject of ridicule and suspicion, in the very community where he had tried to find peace. The final blow came the next morning when Ethan checked his mailbox and found an anonymous letter. It was written on plain white paper, the words printed in neat, blocky handwriting. The note was brief but devastating. "You're not fooling anyone. We know what you really are." There was no signature, no indication of who might have sent it. Ethan read the note over and over, his mind spinning with paranoia. Who had written it? How many of his neighbors had seen it before it was delivered? What did they think they knew about him? The letter felt like an accusation, a threat, a declaration of war. It confirmed his worst fears. The neighborhood wasn't just indifferent to him. They were watching him, judging him, conspiring against him. Ethan spent the rest of the day in a haze, his thoughts consumed by the note and the voices he had overheard. He tried to focus on his work, grading assignments and preparing lesson plans, but he couldn't escape the sense of betrayal that gnawed at him. The people he had lived among for years, the people he had tried to coexist with, had turned on him. They had stripped away the last shred of dignity he had, leaving him exposed and humiliated. That night, as he sat alone in his darkened house, Ethan felt something inside him snap. It was a quiet breaking, Not a dramatic outburst or a moment of clarity, but a subtle shift in his mind. The resentment he had carried for so long began to crystallize into something sharper, something colder. He realized he couldn't live like this anymore. Couldn't tolerate the sneers and whispers and judgment. If the neighborhood saw him as a threat, then perhaps it was time to become one. The first murder was not born out of impulse, but out of cold calculation. Ethan Carter had always prided himself on his methodical nature, and when he decided to cross the threshold from thought to action, he knew there could be no mistakes. He was not an impulsive man, nor one prone to outbursts of violence. For Ethan, this was not about rage, it was about justice. His own warped version of it. His neighbors had painted him as the villain, the outsider, the odd man who didn't belong. They had laughed at him, whispered about him, reduced him to a shadow in their perfect little world. Now, they would learn the consequences of their cruelty, and Ethan would ensure that they suffered for it, one by one. Ethan began by observing his neighbors more closely than ever before, his anger sharpening his focus into something almost predatory. He had always been a keen observer, cataloging their movements and habits from behind his curtains, but now he watched them with purpose. He noted who came home at what time, who left their windows unlocked, who spent time in their backyards after dark. What about this? Who was splitting the patio wood? He'd asked him in the bookstore once, who was splitting the patio wood. Every detail was committed to memory, recorded in his journal, where the innocuous routine of suburban life was transformed into a meticulous ledger of opportunity. He didn't rush. Weeks passed as he refined his understanding of his targets. Patience was a skill he had mastered long ago, and now it became his most powerful weapon. The first target was Cheryl Whitaker, a woman in her late 50s who lived alone 2 houses down from Ethan. She had been one of the voices he had overheard during the Robinsons' barbecue, the one who had laughed and called him subtling. Cheryl was a creature of habit, her days governed by a rigid schedule. Every evening at precisely 9:30, she would take her dog for a walk around the block, returning home by 9:50. The dog was small and elderly, its pace slow and predictable. Ethan knew her route, knew the way she lingered on the sidewalk in front of her house to check her mailbox before going inside. She was the perfect starting point, accessible, predictable, and, most importantly, alone. Ethan spent several nights rehearsing the murder in his mind, playing out every possible scenario to ensure there would be no errors. He knew that Cheryl's house had a motion-activated security light above the front door, but it didn't extend to the side gate that led to her backyard. Her dog, while noisy during the day, was nearly deaf and almost never barked after sunset. Cheryl herself was complacent, her suburban life lulling her into a false sense of safety. Ethan decided that poison would be his method of choice. It was clean, quiet, and, when executed correctly, would leave no immediate trace of foul play. As a science teacher, Ethan had access to chemicals that, when combined, could create a lethal toxin. He prepared a solution in his home laboratory, carefully measuring the ingredients with the same precision he had taught his students in the classroom. The poison was odorless and tasteless, designed to mimic a sudden heart attack. Ethan tested small doses on stray animals he trapped in his backyard, ensuring its potency before committing to the act. The preparation was meticulous, almost ritualistic, and with each step, Ethan felt a growing sense of control over his life. On the night of the murder, Ethan waited until 9:20 before slipping out of his house, a syringe of the poison tucked into his jacket pocket. He wore dark clothing and gloves, his face obscured by a black baseball cap. The air was warm and still, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. From the shadows of his yard, he watched Cheryl emerge from her house with her dog, her movements as predictable as clockwork. She didn't notice him, as he followed at a distance, his footsteps silent on the pavement. When Cheryl returned to her front yard at 9:50, Ethan was ready. He waited until she crouched to check her mailbox, her back to him, before he approached. The syringe slid from his pocket into his hand with practiced ease. In a matter of seconds, he closed the distance between them and injected the poison into her neck, his movements swift and precise. Cheryl gasped, her body stiffening as the toxin took effect, and within moments, she collapsed onto the grass. Ethan caught her before she hit the ground, lowering her gently to avoid any visible injuries. Her dog, oblivious, tugged at its leash, its clouded eyes unaware of what had just transpired. Ethan worked quickly, dragging Cheryl's body into her backyard, where it would remain out of sight until morning. He arranged her as if she had simply collapsed on her patio, her hand resting near an overturned glass of water he had placed there to reinforce the illusion of natural causes. The entire act took less than 10 minutes, and by the time he returned to his house, his pulse had already slowed to its usual steady rhythm. He disposed of the syringe and gloves in a plastic bag, which he later burned in a fire pit in his backyard. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed with the news of Cheryl's death. The paramedics arrived first, followed by the police, who spent less than an hour on the scene before concluding it had been a heart attack. The absence of any visible injuries or signs of foul play made it an open and shut case. Ethan watched from his window as the coroner's van drove away, a faint sense of satisfaction washing over him. He had done it. He had taken control, and no one suspected a thing. The success of the first murder emboldened Ethan, fueling his resolve to continue. Over the following weeks, he selected his next targets with the same meticulous care, each one chosen for their role in his growing narrative of revenge. He varied his methods to avoid detection, tampering with medications, cutting brake lines, even staging a fall down. Each death was made to look like a tragic accident or an unfortunate twist of fate, and each one brought Ethan a step closer to the justice he believed he was delivering. As the body count grew, so did the tension in the neighborhood. Fear began to replace the easy camaraderie that had once defined the community. Ethan watched as his neighbors grew more paranoid, locking their doors and looking over their shoulders. They didn't know who to trust, and in their confusion, they never once suspected the quiet, unassuming man who lived among them. Ethan took pleasure in their fear, seeing it as a form of poetic justice. They had cast him as an outsider, a threat, and now he had become exactly that. But as methodical as Ethan was, the cracks in his plan were beginning to form. Each murder brought with it new risks, new variables he couldn't always control. And while the authorities remained oblivious for now, Ethan knew that no plan, no matter how carefully crafted, could remain flawless forever. Still, he pressed on, driven by the conviction that what he was doing was not just revenge, but a necessary correction to the world that had wronged him. In his mind, he was no longer just a man. He was an arbiter, a force of reckoning, and the neighborhood would never be the same again. Ethan Carter's first murders were clinical, methodical, and devoid of any emotion beyond cold determination. But as the body count rose, the orderly precision of his actions began to give way to something darker, more chaotic, and deeply personal. In the beginning, Ethan approached his plan with the same careful attention to detail that he applied to his lesson plans and experiments in the classroom. Each death was calculated, executed with precision, and designed to appear as an unfortunate accident or natural cause. But as he began to unravel under the weight of his own actions, the murders became more erratic, more brazen, and far less controlled. What had begun as a coldly rational campaign of vengeance against his neighbors transformed into a violent descent into madness. After the first few murders, Ethan found himself obsessed with the aftermath. He would sit by his window, watching the commotion as paramedics and police arrived at the homes of his victims. He observed the shock and grief of the neighborhood with a detached sense of satisfaction, noting how they clung to each other in fear, their perfect suburban facade beginning to crack. He read every news article about the deaths, scouring them for details that might link him to the crimes. At first, the reports only strengthened his confidence. The coroner ruled the first death, a middle-aged man named Richard Porter who lived 2 houses down from Ethan, as a heart attack. The second victim, an elderly woman named Dolores, who had always complained about Ethan's unkempt hedges, was believed to have fallen in her kitchen and hit her head. Ethan had tampered with her kitchen tiles just days before. To the outside world, these were tragic but explainable deaths. To Ethan, they were proof of his genius. But as he carried out more killings, the carefully crafted mask he wore began to slip. He started to relish the planning stages of his crimes more than the execution, poring over his notes late into the night as he plotted his next move. Each new target became an obsession. He began keeping trophies from his victims, small, seemingly insignificant items like a button, a pen, or a scrap of paper. Things he could hide easily, but that held a perverse meaning for him. These objects became symbols of his power over the people who had once belittled and excluded him, tangible proof that he was no longer the invisible, unimportant man they thought he was. But the murders didn't bring him the peace or closure he had imagined. Instead, they fed a growing paranoia that began to consume him. The more bodies he left in his wake, the more he became convinced that someone would eventually figure out what he was doing. Every knock at the door, every stray glance from a neighbor, every passing police car sent his heart racing. He started seeing patterns where none existed, interpreting innocent actions as signs that the walls were closing in on him. A package left on his porch was, in his mind, a warning. A casual wave from a neighbor was a veiled accusation. The paranoia ate away at him, making him jumpy and irritable, even when he was alone. The police presence in the neighborhood intensified after the third and fourth murders. While no direct connection had been made between the deaths, the sheer number of tragedies occurring in such a small area raised eyebrows. Patrol cars began making regular rounds, and detectives were seen canvassing the neighborhood, asking questions that made Ethan's stomach twist into knots. At night, Ethan would pace the length of his small house, replaying every detail of his interactions with the police in his head, scrutinizing his own behavior for anything that might have seemed suspicious. He knew he couldn't afford to make a mistake. But his nerves were fraying, and the cracks in his composure were becoming harder to conceal. His paranoia soon began to bleed into his actions, and his murders grew more violent and impulsive. The careful planning that had defined his earlier crimes gave way to sudden bursts of rage that he could barely control. One night, in a fit of anger, he strangled Alan Robinson, the boisterous real estate agent who had been one of the loudest voices of gossip about Ethan. That's when his rage began to flood him, and after stumping, he grabbed Ethan. It wasn't part of his plan. Alan hadn't even been on his list of immediate targets, but the sight of the man laughing with friends at his doorstep triggered something primal in Ethan. The murder was sloppy, rushed, and filled with mistakes. Ethan barely managed to clean up the evidence, and for days afterward, he was convinced that the police would show up at his door with handcuffs in hand. When they didn't, his fear turned into an almost manic sense of invincibility. He began to believe that he was untouchable, that his neighbors were too blind, too naive to see the monster living among them. But that invincibility came at a cost. The murders were no longer about vengeance or justice in Ethan's mind. They became an outlet for the chaos and anger that had been building within him for years. He started leaving behind subtle clues, almost daring the police to catch him. At one crime scene, he arranged a stack of books to spell out his victim's initials. At another, he carved a small, nearly imperceptible symbol into the wooden banister of the staircase. These acts were his way of asserting control, of proving that he was smarter than anyone who might come after him. But they were also signs of his unraveling, evidence of a mind that was no longer operating with the cold logic that had once defined him. Ethan's physical appearance began to deteriorate along with his mental state. He stopped shaving, stopped maintaining the clean-cut image that had allowed him to blend in so seamlessly. His once pristine home became a chaotic mess of papers, books, and the trophies he had collected from his victims. He rarely slept, his nights consumed by the constant hum of his overactive mind. Purcell was increasingly consumed with the hum of his overactive mind. The boundaries between his two lives, the quiet, unassuming teacher and the meticulous killer, blurred, until he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. By the time Ethan claimed his 15th victim, the neighborhood was in a state of absolute panic. The once cheerful streets were now filled with fear and suspicion. Neighbors stopped talking to each other, their sense of community shattered by the invisible threat that loomed over them. Security cameras appeared on front porches, locks were changed, and children were kept indoors after dark. He pretty much did whatever he felt like in a village at this point. Ethan reveled in the chaos he had created, but even as he watched the neighborhood unravel, a part of him felt hollow. The satisfaction he had once derived from his actions was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of emptiness and despair. The murders no longer gave him the sense of power he craved. They were simply a compulsion, a grim routine that he couldn't stop, even if he wanted to. Ethan's descent into madness was complete, but he was too far gone to see it. To him, the world had always been broken, filled with people who deserved the pain he inflicted upon them. What he didn't realize was that the walls were indeed closing in, and the chaos he had unleashed was not just consuming the neighborhood, it was consuming him as well. Ethan chafed his bed. He waited and waited until his feet hurt, but he was not allowed out of bed. Once daylight returned, the beginning of the end for Ethan Carter came on a cold, overcast evening in late November. The neighborhood, once vibrant with chatter and life, had become a shadow of its former self. Curtains were drawn tight against the outside world. Houses sat in eerie silence, and the streets were empty long before the sun dipped below the horizon. Fear had woven itself into the fabric of the community, choking it of its usual cheer. Ethan watched it all with a mixture of satisfaction and weariness, his mind clouded by the toll of his own actions. He had achieved what he thought he wanted: control, dominance, a kind of twisted revenge. But it hadn't filled the void inside him. If anything, it had grown wider, darker, and more suffocating. And now, despite all his precautions, it was starting to collapse. The unraveling began with his 17th victim, Diane Fletcher, a reclusive widow who lived at the far end of the cul-de-sac. She had never been part of the gossiping circles that Ethan despised, nor had she ever openly disrespected him. But in Ethan's mind, her quiet presence made her complicit. She had watched, just like the others, never once extending a hand or a kind word. In the warped logic of his spiraling mind, this was enough to condemn her. He decided to act impulsively, without the meticulous planning that had characterized his earlier murders. It would be quick, he told himself, a way to silence the nagging voices in his head that told him he was losing his edge. Under the cover of night, Ethan crept into Diane's home. He had become so accustomed to the act of killing that he barely felt the tension he once had. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but as he worked to stage the scene of her death, a supposed fall down the stairs, his carelessness betrayed him. In his haste, he left behind a single thread from his jacket, caught on a splinter of wood at the base of the staircase. He took the thread. He snagged the edge to keep it from looping it over the bottom. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. The next morning, Diane's body was discovered by a neighbor delivering groceries to her doorstep. This time, the police didn't dismiss the death as a tragic accident. The accumulating pattern of unexplained deaths in the neighborhood, coupled with the piece of evidence Ethan had overlooked, finally set the wheels of justice into motion. The police presence in the neighborhood swelled overnight. Crime scene tapes surrounded Diane's house, and detectives worked tirelessly to comb through every inch of it for clues. The thread was analyzed, and it didn't take long for forensic experts to determine that it came from a unique blend of fibers, not commonly found in most clothing. It was the first concrete lead they had in months. Ethan, unaware of the mistake he had made, watched the commotion from his window with a sinking feeling in his chest. Something about the way the police moved, their urgency, told him that this wasn't like the other deaths. They were closing in, and for the first time, he felt a sharp pang of genuine fear. Ethan tried to maintain his composure, but paranoia consumed him. He stopped going to work, calling in sick with vague excuses that didn't convince anyone. His once immaculate home had become a chaotic den of paranoia, with newspaper clippings, maps, and scribbled notes covering every available surface. He rarely slept, jumping at every sound, convinced that the police would come for him at any moment. His carefully constructed facade of normalcy had disintegrated entirely. The neighbors who once avoided him out of indifference now avoided him out of fear, their eyes lingering on his house with suspicion whenever they dared venture outside. The final blow came when the police obtained a warrant to search his home. Ethan had anticipated this, but not quickly enough. He had tried to destroy the evidence, burning his journals, discarding his trophies, scrubbing every surface of his house. But he couldn't erase everything. In his panic, he overlooked the smallest details: a partial fingerprint on a pair of gloves he had forgotten to discard, traces of chemicals he had used in his earlier murders, and the torn page of a journal that had slipped under his bed. These fragments of his life, insignificant on their own, came together to form a damning picture of guilt. When the officers arrived at his door, Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he barricaded himself inside, locking every door and window. From his living room, he could hear the muffled voices of the officers as they announced their presence, followed by the sharp knock of a battering ram against his front door. Panic surged through him, and for a moment he considered making a run for it. But there was nowhere to go. The house was surrounded, and he knew he wouldn't make it far. Instead, he retreated to his bedroom, clutching the last journal he hadn't destroyed, the pages filled with his manifesto, a rambling, incoherent explanation of why he had done what he had done. The standoff lasted hours. Negotiators tried to coax him out, offering promises of safety and a fair trial, but Ethan knew better. He knew that his life, as he had known it, was over. The perfect crime he had envisioned had crumbled under the weight of his own mistakes. He paced the room, clutching the journal, his mind racing through every possible scenario. He thought about ending it all, taking the final act of control before the world could take it from him. But in the end, his desire to explain himself, to make the world understand his reasons, won out. When Ethan finally emerged from the house, it was with his hands raised and his face streaked with tears. The neighbors who had gathered at a safe distance watched in stunned silence as the man who had terrorized their community for months was led away in handcuffs. To them, Ethan was a monster, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in their once idyllic neighborhood. But to Ethan, he was something else. A man who had been wronged, misunderstood, and pushed to the brink. Even as he was loaded into the back of a police car, he clung to the belief that he had been justified, that his actions had meaning. The trial that followed was a media spectacle, with every gruesome detail of Ethan's crimes laid bare for the world to see. Prosecutors painted him as a cold, calculating killer, while his defense team argued that he was a man broken by years of isolation and mental illness. Ethan himself remained eerily calm throughout the proceedings, occasionally glancing at the gallery where his former neighbors sat, their faces pale with shock and anger. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, he didn't react. He simply stared ahead, his expression unreadable, as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the months that followed, the neighborhood tried to rebuild, but the scars left by Ethan's actions ran deep. His house, once a nondescript part of the cul-de-sac, became a chilling reminder of what had happened there. Some neighbors moved away, unable to bear the memories. Others stayed, determined to reclaim the sense of safety they had lost. But none of them would ever forget the quiet teacher who had lived among them, hiding a darkness they had never suspected until it was too late. For Ethan, the story wasn't over. In the confines of his prison cell, he began writing his manifesto anew, convinced that someday someone would read his words and understand the mind of the man who had brought a small Ohio neighborhood to its knees. The aftermath of Ethan Carter's arrest rippled through the neighborhood like the aftershocks of an earthquake. In the immediate days following his capture, the once quiet cul-de-sac became a flurry of activity. News vans lined the streets, their bright lights and relentless cameras capturing every angle of the house that had been the epicenter of such unimaginable horror. Reporters hounded the remaining residents, demanding sound bites about what it was like to live next door to a serial killer. The neighbors, most of whom had once prided themselves on their sense of community, found themselves overwhelmed by the attention, struggling to reconcile the idyllic lives they had built with the nightmare they were now forced to confront. Ethan's house quickly became a grotesque monument to his crimes. Police tapes surrounded the property for weeks as investigators continued to search for every scrap of evidence that might explain his descent into violence. Forensic teams moved in and out of the home, carrying boxes filled with the macabre artifacts of Ethan's double life. The journals, the trophies, The carefully crafted notes about each murder, these items painted a chilling picture of a man who had meticulously plotted the deaths of those he had lived alongside for years. The revelations only deepened the horror. The neighbors struggled to understand how someone they had seen almost daily, someone who had taught their children, could harbor such hatred for them. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood fractured under the weight of the trauma. Families who had lived there for decades began to sell their homes, unable to endure the lingering sense of dread that came with staying. The once pristine lawns grew overgrown, as the remaining residents no longer had the energy or desire to maintain the image of perfection they had once cultivated so carefully. Those who stayed rarely spoke to one another, their trust in their community forever broken. If someone like Ethan Carter could live among them undetected, they reasoned, then anyone could. For the Robinsons, who had been at the center of Ethan's resentment, the ordeal was particularly harrowing. Alan Robinson's murder had been one of Ethan's most brutal and unplanned acts, and Linda Robinson struggled to move on without her husband. She and her daughters eventually left the neighborhood altogether, their house sitting empty for months before a real estate company purchased it and quietly sold it to an out-of-town buyer. For the Robinson family, every creak of the floorboards and every shadow cast by the streetlights had become a haunting reminder of what they had lost. Ethan's trial and subsequent sentencing dominated headlines for months. Psychologists, criminologists, and true crime enthusiasts all weighed in, speculating about what had driven him to kill. Was it his loneliness, his paranoia, a deep-seated mental illness? In interviews, former colleagues described him as competent but distant, while his students recalled a teacher who had always seemed disconnected, as though he were never truly present in the classroom. Some argued that the neighborhood's coldness and exclusion had pushed him to the brink, while others dismissed this as an excuse for his cruelty. Ethan himself remained an enigma. Though his manifesto was dissected and analyzed, it offered no real answers, only ramblings about betrayal, justice, and a desire to expose the hypocrisy of those around him. In the end, Ethan's motives remained as incomprehensible as the murders themselves. The upper limit, the broader public was captivated by the case, and as always happens in the wake of such horrors, it didn't take long for the internet to seize upon Ethan Carter's story. Conspiracy theories sprouted like weeds, with amateur sleuths scouring news reports and court documents for details that might have been overlooked. Some viewed Ethan as a monster, pure and simple, while others painted him as a tragic figure, a product of a broken society that had failed to see his pain until it was too late. Disturbingly, a small but vocal minority of online followers began to idolize him, calling him a misunderstood genius or even a vigilante. His manifesto, which he had hoped would justify his actions, instead became a rallying point for those drawn to his darkness. It was a final, twisted legacy for a man who had caused so much pain. As time passed, the neighborhood slowly began to fade from the public eye. The police tape was removed, the news vans packed up, and the world moved on to the next tragedy. But for those who had lived there, the scars remained. The laughter of children no longer echoed through the streets, and block parties became a thing of the past. The once vibrant community was now little more than a collection of houses, its residents bound together not by friendship or camaraderie, but by the shared trauma of having lived alongside a killer. Though the fear eventually subsided, the sense of loss never truly disappeared. Ethan Carter's crimes had hollowed out the neighborhood, leaving behind only silence, suspicion, and the memory of what had been.